Okay, and we start. Dear friends, welcome to another webinar salon from the Next Generation Forward and the European Law Observatory New Technologies and the IoT Council. I have the pleasure to do the small introduction today. My name is Magdalena Kaili, representing the LNTech. We're supporting today's webinar, which is co-organized by the NGI Forward and the German University of Administrative Sciences and the German Research Institute for Public Administration. The topic is part of the series of the webinars that we have hosted for the last quite many months about data policy and ID, the digital identity issue, which for us is becoming an issue of democracy and rule of law. And therefore, for today, we have distinguished guests and speakers who will give us insights about the self-sovereignty of identity and whether centralized or privatized identities, which is the best solution. Of course, we are looking forward for more official policies from the European Union, but in the meantime, there are many private initiatives that enrich the debate with new factors. So looking forward to your comments. You may always comment or add your questions on the columns on the right of your screen. And I welcome all our speakers and thank you in advance for the time and the precious ideas you will share. And hopefully we meet soon again in physical somewhere in Europe. Okay, enjoy our talk, and I will leave the space for our speakers to join further on. Karsten and Margaret, this is to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Magdalena. I just wanted to leave the floor open to Karsten to introduce the speakers as we agreed upon earlier on, but I can also starting with maybe introducing Professor Martini. First of all, because he's the first speaker, or he will give a small presentation or saying hello to everybody. Professor Martini is a professor at the German University for Administrative Sciences in Speyer, and he is also leader of the area of digitalization at our research institute for public administration in Speyer. And I will hand over to Carsten Berger. I just introduced Professor Martini, and so I think you'll be the one to introduce the other speakers if you want to.
A warm welcome to our webinar on digital identities. We're very happy to have outstanding speakers for our event, and we want to address the question, how can digital proof of identity be simplified? One thing is clear, without digital identities, there's no digitalization of public administration. But so far, neither public players nor private providers have yet been able to develop an ID that offers both security and widespread digital access to public services. However, a little progress is also noticeable in Germany. The German Nutzerkonto has been notified under the eID-Solutions regulation in January, and the electronic ID card will soon be easy to use on every smartphone in Germany. But what is the best technical path for the future? This is what we want to reflect on today. And we expect very interesting statements from our guest, and I give the floor to Mr. Berger.
Yeah, thank you very much for this short introduction words. My first question would be, can you hear me? Because as soon as we started the webinar, I had the problems and were dropped out. I assume that's correct. Okay, thank you very much for these opening words by Magdalena and Professor Martini. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Carsten Berger. I'm a research fellow at the German Research Institute for Public Administration. And together with my colleague Margaret Zeckleman, we will guide you through the webinar today. First, a few technical notes. The event will last about 90 minutes. after the panel discussion, you will have the opportunity to ask questions. However, we invite you to already start with your questions in the chat in a way that we can integrate them into the discussion. And although we haven't already started the event today, I already want to hint that on February 24th, there will be the second part of the webinar in which we will discuss a similar topic, and you're very much invited to join the second webinar as well, of course. Now it's my honor to introduce our experts. It would be possible to talk at length about all of them now. However, since I do not want to talk too long here, but rather let the experts themselves have their say, I will only give you a very brief introduction. Elizabeth Ramirez is an international expert in the field of emerging technologies, human rights, and public policy in the digital world. As a consultant, she has worked with the World Bank, the EU Commission, NGOs, and startups. As an academic, she is affiliated with several renowned academic institutions in the US. Among them, the Kerr Center for Human Rights Policy, Stanford University Digital Civil Society Lab, and the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard. Recently, she has been appointed as founding director of the Notre Dame IBM Technology Ethics Lab. Congratulations for that, and welcome to our panel, Elizabeth. The second expert will be Kai. He is an expert in digital transformation, cybersecurity, trust in digital technologies, and leadership within the space. At Siemens, he is demonstrating in practice how to transform and build trust through leading the Charter of Trust, a global initiative of 17 Fortune 500 companies collaborating to strengthen security of the digital space. Kai is also co-founder of the Twins Foundation, I hope to pronounce it correct, Kai, aiming at rethinking digital identities and collaboratively demonstrating technical solutions to make our digital world more trustworthy. Welcome, Kai.
Thank you. Thanks.
The next expert will be Helmut Nirenheim. He serves in the Ministry of Innovation and Digitalization of the federal state of North Rhine-Westphalia in Germany. There he leads the IT coordination as well as the federal working group and initiatives in the area of blockchain in a digital or in the blockchain government sphere. He's the leader of the blockchain coordination project of the IT Planning Council and also the administrator of the Digital Evidence Network community. Through his initiative, the project European Self-Sovereign Identity Framework was launched within the framework of the European Blockchain Partnership of the EU Commission. Welcome, Helmut. And the next and last expert on the panel is Christopher Sorge. He holds the chair of legal informatics at the Saarland University in Germany. He's also a senior fellow at the German Research Institute for Public Administration in Speyer. His research focuses on the nexus of law and computer science. In particular, he is focusing on technical data protection and technology-related issues on IT security law, including today's topic, electronic signatures and electronic identification. And last but not least, of course, our moderator of the panel, Margaret Zeckleman. She's professor of public law at the German University for Administrative Science in Speyer. Furthermore, she's the CEO of the German Research Institute for Public Administration. You have heard this name already a few times today, I know. And in her research, she focuses on public law, data protection, e-government. In addition, she's working on a German trial project for digital identities, which is called Your ID.
So I think, thank you very much, Carsten. I think you, as soon as you finished your very nice words about me, somehow and either I or the system was so ashamed that we lost you. So to start at the very beginning, I want to open this first round or first section with Helmut Nirenheim and just ask him a very basic but the core question actually: what is digital identity? Can you please explain the term to us?
Yes, thank you very much for being here. I think it would certainly take more than an hour to cover all aspects of digital identity. So how was it in the past? When someone presents himself or herself in person to open a bank account, update a passport or rent a car, all they have to do is to show an identification card, a passport, a driver's license, or a government-issued ID card. It is then clear to the company that you are exactly who you say you are. This is authorized in person. This verification of exactly who you are becomes much more complex in the digital world. You don't know for sure who you are in transaction with. The customer is not physically present to show the ID or show their face. A digital identity now provides the way to verify that an identity matches the identity in the real world. The goal is to make sure you are really dealing with the right person. And for this reason, mechanisms are needed to confirm the identity. A digital identity consists of attributes, for example, for surname or first name, date of birth, maybe email addresses, user ID, password, but also biometric data. And I would like to mention the electronic German ID card, which user can authenticate themselves for online services, for example, for public services. But unfortunately, there are too few applications now. But I think with the Nutzerkonto, as Professor Martini mentioned, we will get more applications to use with the ID card. Another topic is, because you sign up for many services, you also have multiple digital identities. Usernames, password, and credit cards numbers are frequently shared. And for example, to buy online or to access a bank account. And sharing this information, of course, also means users are at higher risk of identity theft. And for this reason, I proposed, that's what I heard in the introduction, I proposed the principle of the self-sovereign identity to the EU Commission in 2018, together with representatives also from Belgium and the Netherlands. And with the European Self-Sovereign Identity Framework, a project within the European Blockchain Partnership, this is currently being implemented. And I think we will hear more details in this webinar or maybe in part 2 with Daniel Dissey. Even the German government has recognized the SSI idea and is planning to implement the use case hotel check-in in this year on the basis of SSI. In the funding project Schaufenster sichere digitale Identitäten, or in English, Showcase for Secure Digital Identities, the Federal Ministry of Economics intends to fund the ID Union project, for example, among others, which is based on SSI. And with this project, nearly 35 SSI-based use cases in several areas of industry, of government, and so on, are developed. And this is my conviction, the SSI will have a great future. And last phrase is, for me, it's I'm really, it's my conviction or important to mention that SSI is not only used for identification or authorization, but also for storing credentials in the user wallets. And this builds a new ecosystem. And these verifiable credentials can be used in various online services. And important is, SSI is not focused only on natural people, but also to organization or IoT devices and so on and so on. I can provide more information about this if necessary, but I think for this first intro, it should be enough.
Thank you very much, Helmut. It was very interesting and much information. So maybe we could go into further details. For instance, you mentioned the phrase digital ecosystem, and we will look further into it. I just want to ask Elizabeth my second question. In her writing, she uses not the phrase digital ecosystem, but digital identity infrastructure. Could you please explain the concept underlying it?
Sure, thank you. And that was very comprehensive, Helmut. So you foreshadowed many of the things I'm sure we'll get into. So digital identity, we often think about in the context of an individual and their identity. And as you pointed out, Helmut, multiple identities in different contexts. The idea of talking about digital ecosystems or digital identity infrastructure is to think beyond the individual, to think in terms of the individuals, but also the institutions, and also the tools and technology, and also the socio-technical and cultural context in which the individual's identity or identities would operate. And I think it's really important to make this shift because what it does is it takes a very technical, tool-based conversation and it contextualizes it in the context of a legal, commercial, social, cultural, and other contexts. No individual in isolation can do very much with a digital identity, even with the most robust technical architecture. As Helmut noted, there have been very limited adoption and use cases for even the German eID card because it requires the fostering and the investment in systems and infrastructure and incentives, importantly. That will become a very important piece of this. So the digital identity infrastructure piece is really thinking about building out all of those different pieces of an ecosystem, but also building and aligning the incentives that go with it so that there is this sort of incentivization of the actual usage of the infrastructure that's built and invested in. The reason I also think about it this way is because privatized identity solutions and private companies are not well equipped or incentivized to provide the correct type of critical infrastructure we're talking about. So many, many years ago, I worked at the Department of Homeland Security in the US where I focused on cyber infrastructure. And the sort of levels of coordination and collaboration required to build critical infrastructure are much more aligned with the incentives and much more aligned with the sort of with the proper role of states and public entities. So obviously talking about the role of the German government here, talking about the role of the EU and thinking about the eID-Solutions framework, it's really important to go beyond, again, the sort of hyper individual focus and think about this overarching ecosystemic approach. And I think another really important thing to think about there is if you're incentivizing robust, secure, and sustainable infrastructure, the incentives can't be the same as the ones that undergird the business models and the commercial incentives of the private companies and vendors that are often driving a lot of this through very, frankly, obscure and opaque procurement processes. So it has to be really, it has to be a system and a process and an ecosystem that's designed and led by the public sector with those incentives in mind. So for now, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. To go deeper into, to dive, if you allow me the joke, if you want to dive deeper into the ecosystem. So I would like to address Christoph from, firstly Kai, to explain it a bit, the technical background of such an ecosystem. How does it work? How are the processes framed, so to speak? Could you outline this, please?
Yeah, and I understand it's also a little bit about the SSI as such, right? So not just the ecosystem, but exactly. The whole concept of SSI. And please excuse me for saying SSI. Of course, we mean self-sovereign identity. So the basic underlying idea, and let me take it a little bit back to the individual level again. Elizabeth was kind of at the ecosystem level. Of course, identity is something individual. It's on the individual level. And that's the basic idea also underlying this concept of self-sovereign identity, is to give back control and power to the individual, to the identity, to the individual user level. Now, to achieve this, obviously, you need to think hard about which technology could actually do this. And the idea of doing this decentralized with a distributed ledger is pervasive. And in that sense, it's blockchain-based. So it's a blockchain-based that has the goal of giving that power back to the user that wants to authenticate with that identity in the first place. Now, at the same time, what we need to be aware of is that giving all of this control to the user, needs to be balanced with the legitimate interest of another party who wants that identity and it needs certain identifiers in the first place, right? So there's this balance that we need to strike. Also, the question of how is that identity verified in the first place is an important one, where eIDAS comes in and could function as a trusted entity verifying that identity in the first place, and then the user can provide certain identifiers to whatever instance needs this identity in the first place. So that's the whole concept of self-sovereign identity. With Twins Foundation that you introduced earlier, which me and some fellow technology positive people found, we want to add yet another element to it. So it's not only self-sovereign, but it's also we call it disposability. So we try to add further properties to this, and it's kind of becoming a time-spaced element to it. Because Elizabeth already introduced, it is very much context specific, how this identity is used. So we think it makes sense to give this time-space dimension. So, the identity becomes time-dependent. It becomes, if you will, context-dependent, and also limited to certain purposes, right? Because the way, and Professor Nirenheim introduced that earlier, or you're not a professor. Are you professor? I'm sorry. But anyways, for me, you sounded like
one. Thank
where,
you.
Where you would be able to add this dimension to an identity and then apply it to all the different use cases, because there are so many. There's even use cases we don't even think about today. So that is important. And last but not least, I know I was asked to talk only about the technology, but I think it is very important to always emphasize that this is not only about technology. It is much more than that. You see, identity, and we heard it also earlier, is just such a big term. So we need to think it through entirely, in its entirety. So only thinking about the technology isn't enough. We need to think about, what does identity actually mean? What are the impacts of a digital identity on the real world? There are substantial impacts, because identity, if you think about it, is kind of the bridge between the real and the virtual world, nothing less. And that's why it's so important, and that's why we have to think about it, not just in technology, but really take the whole context and make it work.
Wow, great. I'm impressed. It's you opened up the very broad scope of identities as the speakers before you did, but it's even broader. So
I'm just building on it.
So now I come to Christoph and want to ask him about a term that Helmut Nirenheim introduced earlier on, the self-sovereign framework, and the EU movement and EU approach to a so-called digital sovereignty, as a, so to speak, phrase of such a self-sovereign framework. Could you maybe outline this also in the context maybe of the Gaia 10 or Gaia X, I don't know how it's pronounced actually, program?
Yeah, so I'm not an expert on the Gaia program, but I'm going to try to relate your questions to the eID context and of the context of digital sovereignty. So a lot has been said already, so I'm trying to not repeat everything that has been said, which makes a lot of sense. But the point is, I think that the EU has its own framework for electronic identities with the eIDAS regulation as the basis. But when people think about authenticating online, the usual thing they think of, I guess, is authenticate with your Google account, authenticate with your Facebook account, and so on. So the reality is that most people will think of the eIDAS regulation. Well, most people will not think of the eIDAS regulation at all, but those who do will think of something cumbersome, which is only for dealing with authorities and takes a lot of time. And I think that is the core issue of the digital sovereignty of the people and of the EU, which would not be a problem per se. If people use Google, I think that's perfectly fine. It's not an evil company. That's even in their motto, don't be evil. But they don't necessarily share the same values that we Europeans usually focus on when dealing with identities. So for me, as a computer scientist dealing with data protection and privacy issues, I think that the core issue is that, as has been said before, there's not that one identity that I want to spread everywhere. But I want to have different identities in different contexts and want to be able to use them in those different contexts. And I don't want one company or one government to basically manage my whole identity with all its attributes. And I guess that is what the self-sovereign identity is about. I can select that for myself, who I entrust my identity attributes. And that is in line with the values that we have in the GDPR, the focus on privacy and informational self-determination. So for me, that is the focus of self-sovereign identities. I don't think it's necessarily related to blockchains. I mean, in an implementation, of course, it can be implemented using blockchains, but I would always see that only as a tool, while the actual identification, the verification of identities needs some trusted entity or trusted entities. It should not be only one entity, but others have to verify identity attributes, and I should be able to choose which identity attributes and which identities I use in which context. And for me, that should be the focus of our topic. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Also that you also came already to the one of the, I say, maybe core questions, if blockchain technology is, so to speak, essential for digital sovereignty or not. I think I heard a bit from your text, and I know your writings as well, that you say it's not. Also that what Carsten mentioned earlier on, my application, your ID or Ihre ID was also based on a wallet and not on blockchain, but it's still discussed. Some people, I know enough people who tell me that it can only be made by a blockchain, but maybe we could deepen this further and come to a second round and to Elizabeth. And I think we could, you also, I think I understand your writings that you're always trying to find the gap or even the connection between the individual and the system, so to speak, maybe. So seen from the individual's perspective, which measures should be taken to safeguard their sovereignty or the control over the data attributed to the digital identity, and how should they be able to influence processing activities. For example, could maybe a social login via Facebook possibility to do so?
Sure, there's a lot to unpack in there.
I'm sorry.
I suppose I'll start with the social login. So social login with Facebook or Google or others has been one of the primary vehicles by which we are tracked and surveilled and stalked and harassed online and by digital means. Those tools are not designed for the benefit of the individual, and certainly not designed to promote the individual's personal autonomy, which is what I prefer to use rather than sovereignty. They are designed for the internal ecosystem and benefit of the large technology platforms and their primary customers, who are effectively the advertisers and the data brokers and the other shadow participants in the digital ecosystem. So though they are construed and given as examples of digital identity solutions, and from a technical standpoint may be categorized as such, when we think about what's in the interest of individual, if you want to use the term sovereignty or autonomy, I would say no, they're absolutely not fit for purpose and not designed to promote those types of end goals. From the perspective of digital sovereignty at a state or national or public level, for example, in respect to the way the EU would use the terminology, there's certainly a concern that these are large technology companies that are from outside the EU that are sort of imposing this methodology and this again infrastructure on a very large market within the EU. So there's a concern there, of course, around the sort of nationalistic priorities of the state from a sovereignty standpoint. If we think about promoting individual autonomy through, if we want to use the term identity, which is also imperfect, but through the way that they interact by digital means. Self-sovereign identity, the way it's often portrayed, the way I've seen it portrayed firsthand and working in and with many of these companies, is a fantasy, because the dictates of what you need to present in different contexts about yourself, the dictates of how you present that, of what is acceptable, of who's making those determinations, is not something that can be solved or changed by introducing a digital wallet or by introducing blockchain or by introducing any of these technologies. Those dictates have to do with power. They have to do with things like commercial and legal forces. They have to do with things that go well beyond the control of any single individual. And so I think what's really dangerous about this conversation and rhetoric is painting self-sovereign identity as some kind of control shifting mechanism that's going to empower the individual in some dramatic way. I think fundamentally, if you're at a border and need to travel, the individual, regardless of what's on their phone or what type of technology they have, really has no say in that conversation. Similar in many other contexts. And so I think we just need to be a lot more honest and humble about what something like self-sovereignty can or cannot do. And also the concern is that it takes the pressure off of addressing the underlying power dynamics and addressing the underlying economic, social and legal frameworks that are legitimizing and basically impeding on the individual's autonomy and, if you want to use the term, sovereignty. So I think that there is a huge disconnect between the discourse and the way that we talk and think about this and the reality of what we need to see shift. Because I do think that many of the folks in the sort of self-sovereign identity conversation are genuinely motivated by wanting to shift those power dynamics. But I think they're absolutely overselling what something like a digital wallet with credentials can do. And the other piece I'll introduce into this is that if we don't address the commercial incentives, it won't change anything. Because what I've seen firsthand is that when you start to ask, what is the commercial model here? How does this work? Do you pay the issuer? Do you pay the verifier? When you start thinking about that, you lose a lot of what the sort of the hyped up selling points are around SSI. So you lose the sort of protection of not phoning home if you have to figure out how you're compensating the different actors in the ecosystem. You lose the sort of incentives to protect the individual. You end up with spam in your digital wallet that's offering you credentials that you don't want. You recreate the exact same dynamics that we've seen with Web 2, and you recreate them with a different tech stack. And so that is fundamentally my concern, and my point is that this is being oversold, it's being misconstrued, and it's fundamentally distracting from what the genuine issues are that are undermining individual autonomy and sovereignty.
Great, thank you very much. I think it's quite enlightening what you told us, and it's maybe a bit disillusioning as well, but it's very good that you stress the topic of power and the shift of power and the balance of power, which has to be reflected in all the discussion about self-sovereignty. Maybe I could address Kai. Oh, sorry, I get confused with English and German. Kai, to again, could maybe blockchain be such a possibility or not in your eyes to provide for, so to speak, technological neutral technology, because the eIDs regulation points out that it's technologically neutral, but means neutrality in this context, actually.
Yeah, that's a great question. If I may, can I pick up on something that Elizabeth said, because I think it's so important, and then come to your question.
Sure.
I think what's also important, and coming from a business, so coming and working at the business, I'm fully aware that there are certain incentives. That's the first question will always be, what's the business model? I think what's also important is that the context also has certain, functionalities, governance functionalities to fulfill, right? If you place SSI or any technology in an environment that isn't living cybersecurity, or it doesn't even care about privacy, I also would fully underline it wouldn't change anything, right? So and probably you need to change that on an organizational level, and that's what we've been working on, and it takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. So to transform businesses into being more aware of what they have to fulfill in terms of cybersecurity, in terms of privacy, in terms of how they fairly use data, and that's a transformation in itself. And SSI can support that, but it will not solve it by itself. There will still be an organization that doesn't live up to these values. So for me, that is fundamentally important. Now, coming from the world of cybersecurity, if I may come to your question, Margaret, in cybersecurity, we love standards and certifications, and sometimes we're also getting a little bit better with the regulatory side, if you will, and all of this is formulated technology neutral, or the best ones are, let's put it this way. So normally what they do is they formulate the goal, but they leave it open as to which technology fulfills that goal, which makes a lot of sense, because you need to strive the balance between the innovation piece. So what kind of innovation is there? What technology might evolve to reach that goal versus the interoperability? Does it operate also with other entities? So this is the balance that needs to be how's the right word? Striked? Is that correct, Elizabeth? You're better at this than I am in English. Anyways, what I want to hint at is that that's the balance that we need to see. And in that sense, for coming, from a technology and innovation background, I think it's good that it is left open, that there is a positive, let's say, competition, if you will, on what technology works best. And even on this group, in the small group, we see that there's already kind of a little bit of a dispute if blockchain is the right way to go or a wallet is the right way to go. So, if we can't even find a consent here, then I think it is good to leave open. One thing that is for sure, SSI is thought to be decentral, which I think is a good thing to start with, because we see that a lot of the infrastructure is also more and more decentralized. Think IoT, think also in cybersecurity. Now everybody talks about zero trust. That's similarly a topic that everybody thinks now this will solve it all, which obviously it won't. Yet another topic that is very high on the list, but you need to do so much more. But what I want to hint at is it needs to be decentral. For me, that is my core belief. If it's decentral, you need to also solve it in a way decentrally, and not with a big central technology. That's what I think.
Great. As I see, there's a very vivid discussion already, and poor Christoph Sorge had already to type into it, because obviously I didn't give him enough floor or space. I will come back to him and ask him if he also, if he agrees with Kai that a wallet would be maybe the better solution, or a blockchain, or even I don't know if a combination is possible. Could you go into some details, please?
So the reason I was typing is that someone pointed out an error I made in the company material of Google or Alphabet, and I just wanted to acknowledge that. So about blockchain or wallet, to be honest, I think we should think about the other way around. So what are the requirements that we need for specific use cases, and what technology can support those? So blockchain can be used for distributed storage, which has the additional property that you cannot change things unnoticed. So you have sort of a digital timestamp, and that can be tied in with eIDs trust services to a certain extent. Actually, I even wrote a publication about that. So I think blockchain can be one tool that can be used for some aspects of digital identity. So you can store attributes, and for example, you can prove after 5 years that you have been using that identity for 5 years. I think that's perfectly fine, but it's not the only way to realize even a distributed identity solution. So there's the classic identity management model with those identity providers, where you can freely choose an identity provider per interaction. That is sort of decentralized, but does not necessarily need a blockchain. So I think we should not have the ideology it has to be blockchain or it cannot be blockchain, but it should be blockchain when we can use the properties of blockchain in a way that makes sense. And in many cases, I think we don't need a blockchain, and a wallet on your smartphone would work just as well. I mean, the German government is thinking of putting the it's not just thinking, they have decided they want to put the identity from the electronic identity card onto the smartphone. And I think that can be seen as sort of an identity wallet, which is a perfectly sensible approach, in my opinion. And it's one technical solution that we can use in some cases, but it should not be the only one. So we can have a competition of different identity services, identity providers, and we can have selection on the government webpage. Would you like to log in with identity provider A, B, or C with your wallet or your blockchain identity? That could work very well.
So thank you so much for this positive picture. Even of a combination or whatever. I think I will ask one last question and then look at the discussion, because I see a very vivid discussion and I don't want to cut it in any case. I have some more questions I could pose, but I think we should integrate the discussion as well. So my last question goes to Helmut, and as we already talked about different models or the technologically neutral approach of the eIDAS regulation of the EU. Could imagine a picture where it is too different for European markets, so to speak, if whatever Estonia and Germany and Austria and which state ever opts for two, I don't know if it's possible, two different models that the German market, the European market couldn't be integrated, or is this not a possibility of this technologically neutral model?
So thank you for the question. I will ask it, but let me give 2 or 3 statements to the speakers, to the statements I heard before. In my opinion, we need to make an offer to avoid data silos with user ID and passwords, which are stolen, and so on and so on. And another topic is, and I really think it's a good topic, is give refugees an identity. So for both things, I think with SSI, we have a good way to solve these both problems. And to the question, blockchain, yes or no? Okay, the concept I have in mind, or not me, it's the W3C and the Decentralized ID Foundation and others. We are aiming to use the blockchain, for example, for storing credential schemas, although not personal data, or to anchor DID documents, the so-called DID documents. So I'm fully agree not to store any personal data on the blockchain, but we need this decentralized concept in order to bring information to spread the information that are needed in order to interoperate with the wallet. And I think the wallet is necessary, and the applications. That's 2 or 3 statements to the speakers before me. To your question, eIDAS. I strongly believe that the eIDAS regulation is an important instrument in Europe. You can like or dislike federalism, whether in Germany or in Europe, it is just there. Federalism is just there. And that's why we need a common standard in terms of interoperability. That's very important, I think. However, I'm not sure that national implementations and safety requirements are done in the same way in all member states. But in this context, it is important that eIDAS is also evaluated and adapts to the current realities. And that is what is happening right now. So thumbs up for eIDAS. And as a follow-up to the ASIF project that I mentioned, eIDAS is also being taken into account there.
Thank you very much, Helmut. So I think I will maybe grab out more or less haphazardly some questions posed in the discussion. And I found some people, for instance, Brian Tang and Gal Lega, who want to know the panelists' view on impact of central bank digital currencies on autonomous digital ID. I think I should give this question to Christoph first.
Okay. I will do my best, though I have to admit I'm not really familiar with the central bank's digital money schemes. Maybe sorry, someone was just phoning me. I have to push them away. So actually, I don't know whether that would be a solution. Maybe someone else can step in.
Oh, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I can jump in on the CBDCs. Thanks, Brian. Good question. So I think this is the clash, right, of systems envisioned for what people frame as self-sovereign identity, and then the priorities, incentives of the sovereign state, and primary among those is, issuing a currency. So obviously, the way that China is thinking about rolling out their central bank digital currency or digital yuan is very much for using this exact same technical architecture and infrastructure for basically surveillance of, financial transactions. It's necessary because, within the remit of the state, of course, is to have that control over the central bank digital currency, because it's effectively meant to be a digital equivalent of a fiat currency, and fiat being within the domain of the sovereign state or the nation state. What's interesting is that the same sort of tech stack is often envisioned and portrayed as severing or trying to sort of loosen the grip of that type of control that you would have from from a central bank, and to create more sort of sovereignty, if you will, over financial transactions and personal financial transactions. But I think this goes to the point that, to the question of, is blockchain necessary? It's really not about the technology. The blockchain, in this instance, the use of blockchain is absolutely not necessary, as many have pointed out. Certainly not necessary in the eIDAS framework. It's not necessary for the wallet infrastructure. It's not necessary for the use of PKI or any other of the sort of technical standards that are necessary. But it's also not decentralized, because what the blockchain effectively introduces is a centralized technical point of failure, right? So if the network goes down, the system goes down, it wipes out everything. This has happened before in Estonia, right? So when we talk about decentralized, it's a bit of a red herring, because we have to ask, what is centralized or decentralized here? The other thing to think about is it's centralizing the risk on the individual. So the individual becomes their own data silo. And when something goes wrong, the questions we have to think about are, what is the recourse for the individual? Who's responsible? Who can they reach out to? So the flip side of the sort of self-sovereignty that's sold here is that the individual is basically out of luck now, and everything is on them. So this is like when you lose your keys, right? In cryptocurrency context, you're basically out of luck. So, if you don't go through a hosted wallet provider. So I think, using these terms loosely without being very precise about when we're applying them and through what lens is just a red herring that is not useful to thinking about what's in the best interest of the individual. So absolutely, this same technology can be used to trace and surveil, and that's why it's being implemented as, through CBDCs in various countries. Whether you remove the sort of actual credential or not from the ledger, for 5 years now, I've been saying, we need to avoid actually storing the credentials on the ledger, and that's sort of been widely adopted, and people are recognizing it's not wise to put, the actual credentials on the ledger. Nevertheless, many of the things that are stored on the ledger, which the ledger is fundamentally a transaction log, it's a database of transactions. There's tremendous metadata on the ledger. There's tremendous linkage to activity that occurs. Again, if you think about what's the implementation in the ecosystem as between the individual, the issuer, and the verifier, and then what the commercial model is layered on top, there are further inferences and tracking that can be drawn. So I think, we have to get past, it's 5-6 years into this conversation around how we might implement this, and we really have to get past some of the superficiality of centralized or decentralized, and think about when you actually start to implement this, what's the impact there? And so for me, as a data protection and privacy lawyer, it's absolutely not rights promoting or rights preserving to introduce a technology, to architect this in a way where all the risk is now on me as the individual. That doesn't help me at all. One of the things, of course I don't like, the Googles and the Facebooks and all of that, and it's a whole nother conversation, but at the same time, what is nice is being able to point to a specific party or a company or institution that's responsible, and to be able to identify and even attempt from a legal standpoint to architect some kind of framework against which to exercise rights and to contextualize them. So that wasn't precisely your question, but I felt that it was really important to say in this context where we throw around these terms really loosely.
Cool. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And it's overwhelming to see the discussion in the chat. I think I can't bundle up all questions, but I will try to. But Carsten signaled me to that he wants to react directly to Elizabeth, actually.
Well, yeah, I could not directly to this question. Actually, I want to give mainly the floor to the chat, because so I will let my personal question be by side. There were some questions in the chat concerning the eIDAS and the European Data Protection Regulation, GDPR. Maybe it's the best question for Christoph Sorge. What do you think? Is the GDPR working? Is it a benefit or is it a problem of developing and introducing eIDs? The same question could be to Helmut. Is eIDAS good or is it a problem? Is blockchain possible? Is the blockchain technology a possible option under the eIDAS? Because some people quoted that it would be impossible to implement blockchain technology under eIDAS.
Okay. Should I start or Helmut? Okay, I can try to start, and maybe you can take over later, Helmut. Okay, so I think the GDPR should not be an obstacle. I mean, it provides some guidelines or some limitations to how you can implement a digital identity. But you will, if you actually need the data to be processed, then you will usually find a justification in the GDPR. You mentioned consent in the comments, which would be one justification. So my data can be processed because I consented into that. It could also be that it's necessary for fulfillment of a contract. So finding the right basis for data processing in the GDPR should not be the big issue if you implement a privacy-friendly eID mechanism. And of course, we also have the data protection by design and by default, which should also apply to eID-Solutions, but we have those. I mean, we have eID-Solutions that only provide the attributes that are actually needed. So realizing that in line with the GDPR, I don't think that's an issue. Concerning the possibility to implement eIDAS conforming trust services on a blockchain. So I've actually written a paper which is currently under review, which talks about the realization of eIDAS compliant timestamps in the blockchain. And I'm convinced that this works, but we will see if the reviewers agree to that. concerning the identification itself. I mean, the blockchain cannot verify an identity and it cannot be a trust provider, but I don't think there's anything that speaks against using blockchain as a storage, for example, to provide long-living identities and to manage revocation, as long as there is some way for the actual identity provider, so the what do they call it, the trust service provider, to make sure that the mechanism actually works. Some influence probably has to be there to be eIDAS compliant, in my opinion. But I might be wrong, and I guess Helmut might be able to correct me then.
Okay, I'm only I'm not a legal how to say, not a lawyer like Elizabeth. I think so in order to answer the question, yes, eIDAS is for me an important thing, as I mentioned earlier, to be interoperable in Europe. And maybe I can show you a little slide concerning, if it's possible. Can I share a screen? I know. Okay. And I don't want to discuss all the details unless the infrastructure concern the European Sovereign Identity Framework. And I only want to say that this is the European blockchain ledger, the EBP ledger, the blockchain. And here you always see some facts about eIDAS compliance. So as I said, I don't want to discuss this picture. I only want to say that this question, the alignment of the European blockchain service infrastructure to the with the blockchain at the basic, at the anchor system, is in scope for the implementing with concerning, although in with the aspects of eIDAS compliance. It's maybe a short statement in order what we are doing in the European Commission in order to bring SSI forward, in order to have a new identity ecosystem based on the blockchain as an anchor, not anchor for the personal data, but for example, the documents.
Thank you so much, Helmut, to share this overview with us also. But I try to bundle up some questions, except for broad discussion on capitalism and digital capitalism as such, and on the question whether blockchain is green or not. We also could maybe come to the points some discussions are hinting on.
May I say one sentence to this question, blockchain green or not? So I fully agree if you say blockchain is not green, but blockchain is not blockchain. We have several consent mechanisms, and that what we are doing in the public services is not to use Bitcoin blockchain, but we use a permission blockchain with a proof of authority. So we have governance to the blockchain, and we have in our opinion, a consensus mechanism which is green, and we can use some small Raspberry Pi computer in order to make up blockchain, for example. So we don't want to. We want to have a green infrastructure, that's right, and I think we can solve this topic by using a consensus mechanism, for example, proof of authority, and not the proof of work, for example.
Okay, thank you so much. Kai smiled also when you hinted on this topic, so maybe we could also deepen the question of is blockchain to opt an accessible, so to speak, solution because it's, I think, ecologically friendly or not. So Kai smiled, so I want to give the word to him.
I was just finding this in a very interesting, different question in a way, and I'm happy that Helmut picked up on it. That would have also been my view. So blockchain, just saying blockchain isn't green is so much of a generalistic statement that it doesn't go far, right? Just like all the other topics. So you need to go a little bit deeper, and then this can be answered. But I think Helmut did a very good job there. So question hopefully answered in a way, and the answer is it depends.
Oh, you must be a lawyer actually, but you aren't.
No, I was a consultant, even worse.
Okay, here we go. So we are confused, but on a higher level. Thank you. So I come to another, I try to bundle up some other questions which are dealing with the question, so to speak, public or private, should be, as we discussed earlier on the topic on central banks and so on. So do you think that the state has to go, or the European level, whatever authorities have to go further into this market, as maybe the phrase self-sovereign identity of or digital sovereignty of the EU maybe implies, I don't know actually, or do you think it should be more open to private initiative? Whoever wants to answer this question.
Well, if I may,
yes,
I think we can have both. So I actually never understood why the government is so reluctant to support digital identities. I mean, the German government has the electronic identity card, but they never did real marketing for that. And other than that, there is not really much that the government does, because eIDAS is leaving that market up to private companies, which of course the competition idea is good per se, but I think some basic identity infrastructure, at least in countries where the state already has all the identity information and issues identity cards, which you use to then go to an identity provider who then issues the identity in the digital world. In that case, the state could just do that himself, knowing very well that the state does not always do these things well. So that's why I'm saying having the private option would be a good idea, but I would be quite happy if, say, the German government provided, which I guess they're starting now, provided some more digital identity and tried to make sure that a decent number of services are actually offered that support these identities.
Okay, thank you. Maybe we could link this question with something Elizabeth told us earlier on. The idea, and I haven't heard about this before, but it's quite striking, that maybe spam could up in your wallet, so to speak. So we have identity spam or identity crap in our wallet. So maybe you could point out how this could work.
I mean, I can follow up on that, which goes back to the question of what is the commercial model, what is the business model, and one of the challenges we've seen is how to fund the infrastructure, how to incentivize different stakeholders to participate, to issue credentials, to accept them, to create use cases for them. And we haven't seen a good answer to that. And so the reason that it's important to think about the role of the state is because the state can think about the individual as a citizen. It can think about the individual as a constituent. It can think about the individual beyond the context of the commercial imperative that the private providers are thinking about this in. So the private companies providing infrastructure are, many of them, again, who have worked very closely with, really, are struggling to come up with an effective commercial model, and they're incentivized by different things. And so your identity infrastructure now becomes subject to that profit motive, to that commercial imperative. And so it engineers different behaviors, it engineers different outcomes, it creates a different user experience, frankly, where that is the reality of the situation. And so there's different incentives to create credentials that may not be necessary, or to introduce cases to present credentials that aren't necessary, to sort of make us comfortable with an over-identification scenario where in contexts where we wouldn't normally have to identify ourselves, and certainly not in the physical world, we're now in a context where we're always incentivized to identify ourselves. So I think it's really important that we're not just the consumer and we're not just a commercial actor and we're not an end user, but that there is this other layer of our identity, which goes to the kind of civic integrity and the civic nature of being, in a public context in the nation state. And so I think what I'm concerned about is that a lot of the governments moving forward are, again, doing this through very obscure and very opaque procurement processes with vendors where they're not bringing in civil society, they're not bringing in, NGOs and activists, they're not bringing in the correct experts. They're relying upon the claims of these companies in terms of privacy and data protection and other human rights implications and taking them at face value. I haven't even seen a human rights impact assessment on any of these technologies. So I think that, governments are ceding a lot of their responsibilities and a lot of their obligations, and understandably so, because they're also under pressure to roll out this infrastructure. There are these deadlines and laws and statutes to sort of provide these interoperable solutions, and the governments perhaps don't have the necessary capacity or the necessary incentives themselves to take this up on their own. However, I think the result is that there is this abdication of responsibility and there is this co-optation of the civic fabric by, frankly, profit motivated commercial imperatives. So I think that's what we have to keep in mind, and that's where we're not going to get to a situation where there's much empowerment of the individual when they're subjected to those types of incentives.
Great. I think you leave me at least with many, even more questions than I had before, but this is good, the implication of good science, actually. I think Kai wants to say something.
Yeah, if I can add to this, I think the question was very much private or state. I do think that it's not the only alternatives, right? So there's much more than that. I mean, look at this panel. There's a lot of academia represented here, for example. Now, and we also need to distinguish, is it about the development of these technologies or these approaches as such, or is it about operating them, and there's even more steps down the line. So that the whole value chain we need to look at. I don't want to overcomplicate it. So let's say that disregard that view for the moment. But I think the number of actors or the different actors that are there, we need to look at the full diversity. If you think about it, most businesses tend to have, let's say, implementation power, right? And have funds to also make things work or put them into practice. Of course, this is simplified, but then the state has a certain regulatory power, which is, it's also important. The academia has knowledge power. And then the citizens do have a certain form of market power. You can debate about this also. And of course, now I risk going down this capitalism thing, but I won't. What I want to hint at is that, all of them coming together and working diversely on the topic, I think, is something that could have a certain value. Now, what I personally believe is that normally in the past or in our history, big technological evolutions, or if you want revolutions, have also brought about institutional evolution and revolution. So maybe we're also challenged to think about, what are institutional forms that could make that possible? And there are some emerging already. Examples I know and I'm working with or working for is, for example, the Charter of Trust, where we're meeting with not only different companies, but also the cybersecurity authorities of G7 countries. And we are coming together discussing certain matters because we realize, look, we're in this together. No one party can solve it. And also there's a certain value in having more of a global view on the topic of cybersecurity because it transcends borders, right? So that, and I see it as a little bit of a new institutional form. Another example is our Twins Foundation, which is, if you will, non-profit. It's not registered as non-profit, but there's people coming together without any salary, driving this topic forward because they think, it's citizens, right? It's a citizen-based approach. And we're implementing this together with businesses because, of course, we also need the money. And, citizens don't necessarily bring the money to the table. and then we do this open source, right? So it can be used. What I want to hint at is, I think we also need that same level of creativity and intelligence we put into the technology. We also have to have on the institutional forms and on kind of making it work. If we do that, then I do think it's possible to combine also these different viewpoints and benefit from them.
Kai, there is a question which is also for you, and it fits to what you just said. So I would just quote it.
Please.
Can you go a bit deeper on the business models that fit with the idea of SSI? Does this work without public funding?
Well, again, I think the business model as such isn't only on identity, but you need to also think about the application. So, I mean, the use case is much more interesting than I think SSI as such, right? What kind of use cases does this permit, or do they permit? And then, yes, I do think that this, think about intermodal transport, for example, where SSI could be used very well, where only certain identifiers are supplied for, depending on the type of service you use. That in itself creates the model, and the intermodality does create a certain form of efficiencies, and that in itself kind of changes the business model underlying public transport. Now, I need to be careful because, of course, public transport isn't fully private, if you will, right? So there's legitimate interest by, the municipalities, for example, here in Munich. So it's tend to be kind of municipal companies. Yeah? But it's going in this direction. And then, yes, I could think of also other use cases where that is possible. But again, I don't think it's black and white. I mean, it's kind of, it could be both, like in that example of intermodal transport. It's not fully private, but it's also not fully state-owned. But yes, I do see that there are business models that could benefit very much from identity or from SSI. And I think the main benefit would be that hopefully, that's my hope, and probably also the hope by the community, that it would balance this, individual autonomy, if you will, of the users and the value of the data that is generated, and that hopefully could be collected without kind of interfering with the individual autonomy. Because you see, in public transport, there are many silos, because they all invented their own little systems. So you cannot optimize the whole system. And hopefully that makes a good business case. And that's, I think, what we will find out in the next very few years, because there's so much happening right now.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think we should come to the last round, actually. I think time went very quick, but we have to come to our last round. And I think I always want to start, and I want to start again with Elizabeth to ask her, seen from a US perspective, is this what we discuss about eIDs and so on? Is this rather small-minded in your view, or does it hint at the right questions?
Yeah, interesting question. I think this conversation is at the same time miles ahead of where the US is, and in some ways behind where the US is. So it's miles ahead of the US in the sense that for various reasons, so you talked about federalism in Germany. Obviously, we have federalism at an even larger scale in the US. We have a very sectoral approach to things like identity in the US. We have very, very limited legal frameworks and architecture around identity, almost none in the US. For example, at a state level, Virginia has an Electronic Identity Management Act, but there certainly aren't the kinds of interoperable legal frameworks and architectures around identity. So in terms of thinking about identity and digital identity strategically and going forwards, in terms of the kind of strategic planning and overhaul, it's not really the lens through which the US is approaching this. We also have a very heavily private sector led, sort of commercially led identity infrastructure. So many of the things we talked about around social login and many of the sort of corporate led identity tools that we're familiar with obviously come from a lot of the large US companies. So we're sort of behind in the sense that we aren't, I mean, frankly, doing any strategic planning around a lot of this. I mean, with the new administration more so now, and we're sort of reinvesting in the digital service and thinking about modernization of Congress and things like that. But in those ways, I would say the US is behind. However, where I think the conversation might be somewhat ahead is that there is more of an emphasis on the socio-technical, on the power dynamics, on the sort of overhauls of society that need to happen. There's often more diversity in the conversation. So I think one of the concerns I have about SSI is it's not a diverse conversation. You know, I'm usually the only woman in the room. It's coming from the same perspective. There's a lot of technologists. We're not going to arrive at a better situation if we just continue to have the same voices in the room. So it's the same in a lot of the standards bodies. It's a lot of the folks that built the standards the last time around, and really have the same blind spots when they think about the considerations that need to be factored in, when they think about the ultimate impacts on people. So we have these very micro views of things like privacy, and we think about them through a very technical lens of, you know, pseudonymization, or we think about them through hashing rather than the contextualized version of privacy, which has to do with the way we actually move in the world. So I think there's some, you know, the frame is just very, very different in the US. And what will be interesting to see is sort of, you know, how it turns out, because it's been very interesting as a data protection lawyer who's practiced in both the US and EU to watch the evolution of data protection law in Europe, starting out from this sort of generalized comprehensive approach, but now in the new legislative package around the DSA and the DMA and the DGA, looking to more sectoral examples of common data spaces around industries. And the US starting out with a very sectoral approach around, you know, health-related privacy or educational context, now starting to try and approach a more comprehensive generalized framework. And so there's sort of this convergence that's happening, that even though we started out in these very different places, we're sort of recognizing that you almost need both at the same time. You do need a sort of comprehensive generalized approach, and at the same time there are particular needs and considerations in the context of specific sectors or industries. So I think a similar thing is going to happen around identity, where we need, again, going back to the sort of infrastructure piece, we need a common infrastructure to enable the use of more particularized use cases and identity-related tools and solutions. So we need to sort of do both at the same time and be comfortable with that level of complexity, I think. So, you know, I think in the next, certainly in the next decade, we'll see. And it's also important to keep in mind how other identity infrastructure is emerging and shaping in other countries and geographies and contexts. And so certainly CBDCs will be part of spurring that. But I think the European framework right now, I think what it has most strongly going for it is the underlying legal architecture to accompany what's being built out from a technical standpoint.
Thank you so much. I think what you told us, we are behind, and maybe before the US discussion can be maybe illustrated by this, by a recent example, when I just learned about this lawyer who was, so to speak, morphed into a cat while talking on the court. My reaction was not, oh my God, he looked like a cat, but my reaction was, oh my God, he used a private computer. And oh my God, the judge posted some information from the pledge to the broad public. Oh my God, this is really funky. Yes, we couldn't think of this in Germany. This would be, the lawyer would, I think, have severe problems, and the judge would have even more problems. So I think this is maybe be in a way forward and behind the US. So I want to come to Helmut. I think what are the next questions in your opinion, actually? In Europe, I mean, sorry, on the European level. How could future look like?
Oh, I hope future looks like great. What do you mean in detail?
Sorry, maybe you could hint at some, I don't know, plannings or acts or hearings.
Okay. What I can say about Germany, for example, we have the a great act, the German Online Access Act, and over 500 administrative services are to be digitized in order administrative services from the armchair. Full stop. The Online Access Act created real pressure in the administration for the first time, and with the necessary funding, the argument we don't have any money was invalidated. It remains to be seen what will happen in this coming months. The end of 2022 is not a very long time. So that's a short statement concerning what is happening in Germany in the public services in the moment. The other hand, and then I come again to my favorite SSI. We want to make build this new ecosystem, and in my opinion, and I hope Elizabeth will agree with me when she says we have a spam of credentials. I hope not that we have a spam of credentials, but we have an ecosystem. We have the necessary credential at the user, and he don't have to go to the municipal in order. He has all these certificates he needs for public services and other services. That's what I want to work in the next months and year in order to show whether this approach is good for the future and avoid data silos. And that's what I said earlier in this webinar.
Thank you, Helmut. The Online Access Act is a famous German Online-Zugangsgesetz. And then I want to give the word to Carsten, who wanted to pose the last two questions, I think. Or not?
No, not really. I had one more question to Elizabeth, but as the time is running out, let's leave the floor to Kai and Christoph for their last statement.
I think, Kai, do you want to add something to Helmut's, Elizabeth's small look into the future or into the glass? I don't know how you call it.
Yeah, my immediate reaction when you've posted the first question to Helmut, how does the future look? I was like, it can only get better in a way, but that's probably more the macro level if you think about it. If I look at the micro level, I think it is already good. We have a good starting point. There's a lot of ideas. I can only second what Elizabeth has been saying, and also some others shared here. I do think it needs a diversity of perspectives, our discussion, and I can share maybe some experience we have made in the cybersecurity community. There it was pretty much similar, and we still have to work on kind of opening up and also terming a language that is accessible, right, in the first place. So we have had a history of complaining that people or the users are the biggest problem because they don't understand what we want, right, as cybersecurity professionals. Now, that thinking is so flawed if you think about it, because it's not the user's problem that they don't understand our language, but it's our problem because we probably speak a language that nobody understands. And I think in identity, we will go hopefully down a similar or the same road, because everybody, of course, understands the word identity, but the whole universe that is behind that concept, of course, is already overwhelming, let alone what a digital identity is. So I'm practicing very hard with my small little kids, kind of trying to explain them why is digital identity now important. Likewise, I do with my mom, who's now over 70. And these kinds of exercises, that's the really difficult ones. But we need to do that more often, bring in maybe more people to these discussions and try to really not only term a language, but also kind of explain what are these opportunities that we all foresee, because deep in ourselves, of course, we're positive about it. But if we can't sell that idea, if we can't sell the concept to a variety of stakeholders, then they wouldn't go far. They won't go far. So I think that's the challenge that I would want to pose not only to this panel, obviously, but also to the chat, because I've seen a lot of, very specific language used there, which is nice because people are in their communities. But let's be more accessible, because if we really want to see identity work in practice, it needs to work for everybody. It needs to be inclusive. So let's start with the language and then transfer this to the technology. Thank you.
Thank you. So sorry, Christoph, that I don't let you look into the crystal ball. So I will instead give the last words to Carsten.
I think, Christoph, if you want to add something short, the floor is yours. It's yours. No problem at all. We have 1 minute more.
Okay, I can have that minute, and I will take it. So concerning the current state of identity management, I was very disappointed with the German Parliament recently passing the Registermodernisierungsgesetz, where the best approach for identity in e-government for them seems to be that everyone gets one number which is used across all sorts of sectors. But on the other hand, I mean, we see the discussion here, the topic of identity management is in the political discussion, and that's much better than the state was 5 or 10 years ago. So I think we can look forward to really getting better identity management, both on the state level and for private stakeholders. So let me try to be somewhat optimistic. And thanks for having the last minute now.
Thank you. I think those are the best last words we could have. Let's stay sort of optimistic. So we want to thank all the discussants. I don't know, Carsten, do you want to thank?
Yeah, just thank you to everybody, everybody's taking part in the chat to ask questions. I think we saw a very fruitful conversation, and it was very interesting to have the European perspective, the German perspective, as well as the American perspective, which is, I think, a very, very important point, because we had some difficult years behind us in the Atlantic relations, but I think this is very, very important to work on this topic together, because even though we might have differences in details, we should take into account that in the end we both believe in a democratic and a free system, which is not for granted in this world. And by saying this, we should work together and find solutions, transatlantic solutions. And I think we should continue this talk, and we will continue this talk by the next webinar, 24th of February. Again, the invitation. For now, it's nothing more to say than thank you very much to Helmut, to Kai, to Elizabeth, to Margaret, to Christoph. That was the way I see you on my screen, and not any ranking. So thank you very much for taking your time. Thank you to all people who organized in the back. Thanks to the NGI, and thanks to Professor Martini, and to my colleague Michael Kolain and Rob van Graanbroek, who did a lot of work in the back. Yeah, thank you very much, and have a good day. Stay safe and stay healthy in this time.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.